found in the business of generating trajectories to the moon is it's not easy because of the interaction between the Earth, Moon, and the spacecraft. Near the Earth, the trajectory looks exactly like a conic section, a two-body solution. And in our case, it's a very elongated ellipse because the perigee has to be near the Earth and the apogee has to be near the Moon. So that pretty well describes defines the orbit that you have to fly. In the vicinity of the Moon, it looks like a hyperbola, and it looks very much like a hyperbola. But there's that no man's land out between them that both bodies affect the spacecraft pretty heavily, and so the solution really requires all of the bodies to be present. And then if you add the sun, it's orbital. I want to make a comment about why we have to add the sun, and we and part-time scientists are working on that right now. The sun, if we were talking about just the perturbation of the sun, the spacecraft, it's low. The problem is that it perturbs the moon as well. So if you're calculating a trajectory to the moon and you consider the effect of the sun on the spacecraft, then you also have to consider the effect on the moon itself. Otherwise you get a situation where you're considering the acceleration of one body and not the other. The motion of the moon due to the solar perturbation is extremely complex, and the Brown-Hill theory involves thousands of terms in a Fourier expansion. So we're always looking for simplifications and modifications that will let us study the problem without having to generate these vectors. I will say that Robert was asking me yesterday how long it took to calculate one of these trajectories. And the answer is minutes, not hours, maybe 20 minutes. It's not a hard problem because if you're using a variable step Runge-Kutta sort of integrator, it only takes a couple of hundred integration steps to get there. It's not like trying to calculate thousands of orbits of low Earth orbit. It's a simpler problem than that in terms of just integrating equations of motion. And so it doesn't take great gobs of computer power. I've calculated lunar trajectories on IBM 1130, which was an ancient 16-bit computer. You'll like the 1130, we had 16K of RAM, that's K bytes, 16K, and a hard drive with 512K. And we were calculating lunar trajectories on that, so pretty interesting. Now, the part where it comes in more difficult is deciding how to get there. If you consider the problem, here I am in low Earth orbit and I want to go to the moon, how do you do that? Where do I start the burn to go into translunar orbit? And how long do I thrust? All that sort of thing. You can, in an ordinary numerical integration, we do what we call are you seeing me bounce back and forth? I guess. I'll try to be still. If you give the trajectory an initial set of initial conditions, a position and velocity relative to the Earth, you just let it run, just integrating the equations of motion, you can follow it out and you arrive somewhere. But that somewhere is hardly ever at the moon. You can go through some spherical trig sorts of calculations and help to narrow down the search, but eventually you're going to have to do a search. I first went to work for GE, they had none of that stuff. They had the in-body program, very accurate numerical integrator that could solve motion around all the planets plus the moon. But they had nothing in the way of calculating what the initial conditions should be. And their advice to me was, just run the trajectories till you get near the moon. And that's just not workable. You've got 6 degrees of freedom. You can't just do trial and error on that. So what we did was I worked out a lot of spherical trig type stuff to come up with the geometry that we needed, the orbit plane, trajectory plane, the lunar orbit plane, so forth, of course, the equator, and work out the geometry that would get us near the moon. Now, because of the perturbation, you don't actually get there still, so you still have to do an iteration in some fashion. And the problem, when you look at it that way, is called the two-point boundary value problem, and it's one of the most difficult in dynamics to work, because it essentially involves an iteration on the initial conditions that will reach the final condition that you want. Well, during my period at both NASA and GE, I wrote quite a number of programs that would solve that, and that's really sort of what I claim to be my claim is that claim to
Jack, hello. One thing, due to the time we're passing, I think we should do the question part now, if you feel up to it. Huh?
Okay.
If everything's fine with it? Okay.
I just wanted to say one more thing.
Yeah, okay, no problem, sorry. Yep.
At GE, I worked on, one of the first, I think, to work on abort trajectories. We had what we call a fast return, and the circumlunar trajectory was a free return. And if any of you saw the movie Apollo 13, there's a conversation there where, you know, the flight director gets told that there's a problem, and he says, can we do a fast return? And the other guy says, no, we'll have to do a free return. And I really like that exchange because that just describes my entire work for Apollo. Okay.
Okay.
Any questions?
Can I just ask anyone who wants?
Yeah.
Can I just ask anyone who wants to ask a question, just to queue up and use the microphones here, rather than shout out, because poor old Jack's not going to hear it. Go ahead. Yep.
Hi. I was just curious, since you were talking about how computing power was so different back in the 60s compared to what it is now, if you are doing anything substantially different in terms of planning the trajectory for this mission, is there a different approach or different methods that you're using to take advantage of all of the computing power that you have now?
Actually, there is a couple. The first thing is that on the Apollo missions, even if we were landing on the moon, it was still a free return trajectory. Is there a problem? Okay. The idea was that when we leave the Earth, everything goes right. We need no mid-course corrections. Our guidance has been perfect. We'll go back to the Earth and re-enter in a satisfactory re-entry corridor. We did that obviously for safety reasons, even when we were planning to land on the moon. We don't have to do that for the Lunar X PRIZE. If we miss the moon, we don't really care where it goes after that. So we can use trajectories that are a little bit different. And the key thing is